Eudaimanya, systems and frameworks to improve habits, mind, and life.
Welcome to Eudaimanya, Atomic Habits. Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of extreme precision.
Right, it's very clinical.
Exactly. I mean, you break your arm, the doctor puts you in an x-ray machine, and there it is. Just a clean, white, jagged line on a black background. It is entirely binary, broken or not broken. You can point right at the problem.
And, it is incredibly comforting to have that level of visibility. We naturally gravitate towards systems that are neatly categorized. You see the fracture, you cast the bone, you wait 6 weeks.
But then you stink into the world of human behavior.
Oh, yeah. That's where the x-ray machine fails entirely.
It really does. You try to diagnose why we do the things we do, our daily routines, our neurodevelopment, our cognitive architecture, and suddenly you aren't looking at a clean fracture anymore.
Not at all.
You're looking at a deeply complex biological motherboard where, honestly, half the wires are hidden in the dark.
That is a much more accurate visualization, I think, because when you attempt to map out the causality of human action, you are dealing with an intensely interconnected web. It's neurological impulses, it's environmental triggers, and deeply ingrained narratives about who we think we are.
You can't just point to a single wire and say, there's the procrastination.
Right. It simply doesn't work that way.
Which is the fundamental reason we are here today. If you were listening to this right now, whether you're commuting to an office or walking the dog or just trying to figure out why you can't seem to stick to that new language app, consider this deep dive a high-level addition to your own cognitive toolkit.
And we should be clear, we are not here to offer motivational platitudes.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah,
We are not
okay.
conducting a self-help seminar or giving you a list of inspiring quotes.
Exactly. We're embarking on a strict, rigorous, technical analysis of human behavioral architecture, specifically utilizing the framework developed by James Clear.
Because our objective today is to dissect the precise engineering behind why you do what you do. And more importantly, we're going to look at how to hack that very system by prioritizing relentless mechanics over, well, fleeting goals.
But doing so requires a complete paradigm shift. I mean, we have to completely strip away these romanticized cultural notions of willpower and taking massive action.
Because they just don't hold up, do they?
They don't. Those concepts are practically useless when you look at the actual neuroscience. Instead, we are going to treat human behavior as a mechanical system, a system that can be audited, disassembled, and reverse engineered down to its absolute smallest atomic components.
To really grasp the mechanics of this framework, it helps to look at the crucible in which it was initially formed. Because it wasn't born in a pristine psychology lab.
Far from it. We actually have to go back to 1998 to a high school baseball field.
Yeah, we are looking at a violent, forced entry into the mechanics of recovery. James Clear, who was a sophomore at the time, is struck directly in the face by a baseball bat that just slipped from a classmate's hands.
And the impact was right between the eyes.
Just brutal.
The physiological damage here was catastrophic. I mean, the sheer kinetic force of a swinging wooden bat hitting a human skull is devastating. The impact shattered his nose into this distorted U-shape.
And it was so severe that the soft tissue of his brain actually slammed against the inside of his skull.
Right, which caused immediate and massive swelling. Within fractions of a second, he suffered multiple skull fractures, and both of his eye sockets were completely shattered.
The details from the source material are genuinely harrowing to read. After the impact, he is bleeding profusely, sitting in the nurse's office, and he's trying to answer basic diagnostic questions. But his cognitive architecture is already collapsing.
Yeah, he thinks the year is 1998 when it's actually 2002.
He cannot remember his own mother's name. It takes him a full 10 seconds just to recall it. And by the time a helicopter arrives to airlift him to a hospital in Cincinnati, his body is systematically shutting down.
Right. Basic autonomic functions like swallowing and breathing are failing. He begins having multiple post-traumatic seizures.
It's terrifying. So the medical intervention required placing him into a medically induced coma and attaching him to a ventilator.
If we go back to our motherboard analogy for a second, this is the physiological equivalent of a forced hard system reset.
Exactly. And when he finally regains consciousness the next day, the cascading effects of that cranial trauma are still unfolding. He lost his sense of smell.
And there's that one horrific detail in the text.
Yeah, where a nurse asked him to blow his nose to test his olfactory function. And the trapped air was forced through the shattered orbital fractures, causing his left eye to physically pop out of its socket.
held in place only by the eyelid and the optic nerve.
It is a staggering, just overwhelming amount of physical trauma. And months later, he is in physical therapy, tasked with relearning the most foundational motor patterns a human being can execute.
Things like simply walking in a straight line.
Right. But looking at this through the lens of behavioral architecture, we shouldn't just read this as an inspiring story of a guy overcoming adversity.
No, we need to look deeper. We need to analyze his recovery period as a pristine empirical lab.
An empirical lab. Let's unpack that.
Well, think about the psychological state of a human being who has been reduced to absolute ground zero. When you have to relearn how to walk in a straight line, relying on a sudden burst of, motivation to transform your life, it's physiologically and psychologically impossible.
You cannot make a massive leap.
Exactly. You cannot rely on raw willpower when your brain is still actively healing from severe swelling. Behavior change, recovery, progress in this state, it must be engineered through microscopic, intensely manageable units.
Because the biological system simply cannot handle a massive load.
Right.
I mean, if he wakes up from a coma and tries to set an outcome-based goal of becoming a college athlete, on the exact same day, he can't walk a straight line.
The gap between his current reality and his goal is just too vast. The system crashes.
The brain is completely overwhelmed by the friction.
Right. When you are at ground zero, you quickly discover that grand, sweeping ambitions are practically useless without a granular, microscopic system to support them. You are forced to rely on tiny, almost imperceptible improvements just to survive the day.
And this forced limitation acts as the perfect testing ground for what Clear later codified in his framework.
It proves, under the most extreme duress, that massive success doesn't require massive action. It requires persistent atomic action.
I want to scale this concept up for the listener, because this isn't just about a single teenager recovering from a medical trauma.
Yeah.
This exact same logic, this reliance on microscopic increments, was applied to a massive organizational strategy.
Yes, the sources point us to the British cycling team in 2003. Talk about an organization that was at its own kind of ground zero.
Oh, their historical record was abysmal.
They had won only a single Olympic gold medal since 1908.
A century of systemic mediocrity.
Literally. They were performing so poorly that top European bike manufacturers actually refused to sell equipment to the British team.
Wait, they refused to sell to them?
Yeah, the manufacturers calculated that having the British team ride their bikes would actually hurt their commercial sales. It was bad for the brand.
That is a phenomenal level of institutional failure. So they bring in Dave Brailsford as the new performance director. And what I find fascinating is that Brailsford didn't walk into his first meeting and set a massive, intimidating goal.
No, he didn't say, we're going to win the Tour de France tomorrow. Let's summon our willpower.
Right. Instead, he implemented a strict philosophy that he called the aggregation of marginal gains. The entire strategy was predicated on searching for a tiny 1% margin of improvement in every single overlooked, seemingly mundane area of the sport.
He took the concept of atomicity and applied it to an entire athletic ecosystem. They didn't just look at the obvious things like the weight of the bikes or the athlete's diet.
I mean, granular.
Extremely. The sources detail how they created rigorous testing protocols for massage gels to see which specific chemical composition led to the fastest muscle recovery.
They even hired a surgeon, right?
Okay. Yes, a surgeon to come in and teach the cyclists the optimal clinical way to wash their hands, simply to reduce the probability of catching a cold by a fraction of a percent.
They placed the athletes' outdoor racing suits in a wind tunnel and realized that their indoor suits were actually more aerodynamic, so they just had them wear the indoor suits outdoors.
And sleep. They figured out the exact type of pillow and mattress that led to the optimal REM sleep for each individual rider. And then they physically transported those specific pillows to every single hotel on the racing circuit.
They even painted the inside of the team transport truck stark white.
Which is a perfect example of a marginal gain. By painting the floor white, they could spot tiny specks of dust that might degrade the aerodynamics of the finely tuned bike gears.
It sounds obsessive, almost bordering on neurotic.
It does, but the mathematical reality of this approach is staggering.
Let's look at the actual output of aggregating those 1% margins. Within 5 years of Brailsford taking over, at the 2008 Beijing Olympics, British cycling won 60% of the gold medals available.
And 4 years later in London, they set 9 Olympic records and 7 world records.
And they went on to win the Tour de France 5 times in 6 years.
It is the absolute mathematical proof that habits are the compound interest of self-improvement. A 1% improvement each day isn't just noticeable over an extended timeline, it is mathematically exponential.
If you get 1% better every day for a year, you end up 37 times better by the time you are done.
Conversely, if you get 1% worse, you decline nearly down to zero.
I want to introduce an analogy here to ground this for you, the listener, because the math makes sense, the physical therapy recovery makes sense, the cycling results make sense, yet we still resist it.
Oh, deeply.
To me, setting a massive outcome-based goal like saying, I'm going to lose 50 pounds by summer or I'm going to write a novel this month, is like buying a lottery ticket.
That's a great way to put it.
You're betting all your psychological energy on this one massive payout, this one singular event. But building atomic habits, like testing massage gels or walking one extra step in rehab, is like investing in a slow, compounding index fund.
It's boring. It's microscopic.
Right. You don't see the returns on Tuesday. But it mathematically guarantees a return over a long horizon. So, if this 1% compounding index fund logic is demonstrably, mathematically, and historically more effective, why is the human brain so deeply resistant to it?
Why do we constantly want the lottery ticket?
Exactly. Why do we resist the index fund?
That tension points directly to a fundamental biological hurdle. To understand that resistance, we really have to look at the evolutionary history of the human brain. Evolutionary biologists distinguished between two types of environments.
Good.
For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived in what is called an immediate return environment. In that state, every choice had an instant consequence. You see an animal, you hunt it, you eat it, you survive. You see a storm gathering, you find a cave, you stay dry.
So everything was tied to the present moment.
Absolutely. The human brain developed an incredibly powerful bias toward instant gratification because prioritizing the present moment is exactly what kept your ancestors alive.
The neurological pathways that reward immediate action with a chemical payout were heavily reinforced over millennia.
Right.
So the hardware running our brains today is literally outdated for the complex goals we are trying to achieve in the modern world.
It is a severe hardware mismatch. We now live in a delayed return environment. I mean, think about the modern structure of society. You go to work today, but you don't get a paycheck for 2 weeks.
You endure a tough workout at the gym today, but you won't see cardiovascular changes or weight loss for months.
You save money today for a retirement that is decades in the future. The modern world requires an incredible capacity for delayed gratification, but our neurological hardware is still screaming for immediate payouts.
That perfectly explains why the 1% improvement feels so hollow at first. The brain looks at a 1% change like choosing to read one page of a book or swapping a soda for water, and it evaluates it through that prehistoric lens.
Exactly. It says, this tiny action isn't going to keep me alive right now. There's no immediate payout, so it's not important. Abort the action.
The evolutionary mismatch is precisely why relying on willpower is a losing game. You're fighting hundreds of thousands of years of biological programming.
If we want to hack this outdated hardware, we need to bypass raw motivation and look at the actual architecture of behavior. We need to understand the structural mechanisms of how change actually happens.
Let's do that. Let's break down the system and move into the architecture of behavior. The framework provides a very clear visual model for this, conceptualizing behavior change as 3 concentric circles structured like the layers of an onion.
It's a vital visualization. So the outermost layer of this onion is outcomes. This is what you get. Losing 20 pounds, publishing a book, winning a championship, hitting a quarterly sales target.
Okay, that's layer 1.
The middle layer is processes. This is what you do. Implementing a new gym routine, organizing your desk every evening, or practicing scales on the piano.
And the core.
The innermost core layer is identity. This is what you believe. Your worldview, your self-image, your deeply held judgments about yourself and the people around you.
The fundamental flaw in how most of us approach change is our starting point. We almost always start from the outside in.
Thank you.
If you ask someone about their New Year's resolution, they start with the outcome. They say, I want to lose 20 pounds. Then they move one layer in and figure out the process. I will eat salads for lunch.
Yeah.
But they never touch the core.
They never touch the identity layer.
Right.
And leaving that core layer unexamined is exactly why the behavior rarely lasts past February. If you force a change in your processes to achieve an outcome, but your underlying identity remains completely unchanged, you are fighting a war of attrition against your own self-image.
You are relying entirely on the friction of willpower, which we already established is a finite resource.
Right. So to navigate these layers effectively, the framework outlines 3 operational pillars: We can think of this as the triad of the atomic methodology.
Okay, let's break down the triad.
First, we have atomicity, which we've just discussed, the 1% compound interest, making things incredibly small to bypass the brain's resistance.
Got it.
Second, we have choice architecture, which is the deliberate engineering of your physical and digital environment to make the cues for good habits glaringly obvious.
And the third pillar?
Identity voting, which ties back to that innermost core layer of the onion, the process of aligning your actions with a new self-image.
We'll dive deep into choice architecture and identity voting shortly. But before we can build anything with those pillars, we need to understand the endless background process running in the brain.
The core software.
Right, the four-step neurological loop.
This loop is the mechanism that governs every single habit you have. It happens in the same order every single time, often in fractions of a second. Cue, craving, response, and reward.
Let's walk the listener through this, because identifying these 4 steps in your own life is the first step to taking control of the system. Let's start with step 1.
Step 1 is the cue. This is a trigger that initiates the behavior. It's a piece of information that predicts a reward.
In our prehistoric immediate return environment, cues were physical, right? The smell of water, the sight of a fruit-bearing tree.
Exactly. Today, cues are often secondary predictors of reward, like the buzz of a smartphone notification signaling social approval, or the glow of a television screen signaling entertainment.
And the cue then leads immediately to step 2, which is the craving.
Right. The craving is the motivational force behind every habit. It is crucial to understand that you do not crave the habit itself. You crave the change in internal state that it delivers.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. A smoker does not crave the physical act of inhaling burning tar. They crave the chemical feeling of relief and relaxation it provides. You don't crave brushing your teeth. You crave the feeling of a clean mouth.
Let me pause you there, because the distinction between those first 2 steps is critical. The cue is simply noticing the reward, but the craving is actually wanting the reward.
Right.
The framework categorizes this first half of the loop as the problem phase. You notice something in your environment, and it creates an internal desire to change your state.
That's a perfect way to frame it. The problem phase creates tension. Then we move to the solution phase to resolve that tension. Step 3 is the response.
The actual action.
Yes, this is the actual habit you perform, the thought you have, or the action you take. Whether this response actually occurs depends entirely on how much friction is involved.
So if the response requires more physical or cognitive effort than you are willing to expend, you just won't do it.
Exactly. And finally, step 4, the reward.
And the reward serves a specific biological function.
2 vital biological purposes, actually. First, it satisfies the craving, resolving the tension created in the problem phase. Second, and more importantly for long-term behavior, it teaches the brain whether this specific 4-step loop is worth remembering for the future.
If the reward is satisfying, the brain strengthens the neural pathway.
Precisely.
Now, James Clear maps his 4 laws of behavior change directly onto this biological loop. This is the practical toolkit for you, the listener. If you want to build a good habit, you have to hit all 4 points of the loop.
Let's lay them out.
For the cue, the first law is make it obvious. For the craving, the second law is make it attractive. For the response, the third law is make it easy. And for the reward, the fourth law is make it satisfying.
And the inverse is equally true. If you were trying to break a bad habit, you simply invert the laws. You make the cue invisible, make the craving unattractive, make the response difficult, and make the reward unsatisfying.
I want to look much closer at the biology of the craving stage, because the source material highlights a really fascinating experiment from 1954 by neuroscientists James Olds and Peter Milner.
Oh, the rat experiment. This is foundational.
They were running tests on rats, specifically trying to isolate the function of dopamine. They chemically blocked the release of dopamine in the rats' brains. And the result wasn't just that the rats were a bit sluggish.
No, the results were profound and absolute. When dopamine was blocked, the rats lost all will to live. They wouldn't eat, they wouldn't drink, they wouldn't mate.
They just stopped functioning.
They simply withered away and died of thirst, even when water was placed mere inches from their mouths. It proved that dopamine isn't just about feeling good. It is the chemical engine of desire and motivation.
But the truly critical insight from modern neuroscience, which completely flips how we think about motivation, is when that dopamine actually spikes.
Yes.
I think most people assume you get a hit of dopamine after you do the hard work. You run the mile, you get the dopamine.
That was the prevailing assumption for a long time. But modern brain scans reveal a much more complex reality. Dopamine actually spikes before the action takes place.
Before.
It is driven almost entirely by anticipation. Consider a gambler at a casino. When they hear the bells of a slot machine and see the flashing lights, that's the cue. Their dopamine spikes before they ever pull the lever.
It's the anticipation of the potential payout that provides the chemical energy required to take the action.
Exactly.
So applying that to our daily lives, the brain turns habits into a dopamine-driven feedback loop, where the wanting is actually more powerful biologically than the liking.
The brain literally has far more neural circuitry allocated for wanting rewards than it does for actually enjoying the rewards once we get them.
Which has massive implications for how we design our behavior.
Mm.
It means if you want to engineer a new habit, you cannot rely on the eventual satisfaction of the reward. You have to manipulate the anticipation.
You have to design the choice architecture so that the cue is glaringly obvious, and the anticipated reward is so attractive that the resulting dopamine spike propels you past the friction of actually doing the work.
Before we move off this architecture, I want to introduce some heavy pushback on that outermost layer of the onion we discussed earlier. Outcomes.
Okay, let's hear it.
The framework strongly argues that we shouldn't focus on outcomes or goals. But let's look at the reality of the listener's life. Society is entirely structured around outcome-based goals. We live in a world of quarterly corporate earnings reports, marathon finish lines, objective weight loss targets, and strict sales quotas.
That's entirely true.
If the whole world runs on outcomes, isn't it naive or even counterproductive to suggest we abandon them? Don't goals serve a vital practical function in directing our energy?
That is a very common and valid critique. It's important to clarify that the framework does not argue that goals are completely useless. Goals are highly effective for setting a direction. You need to know if you are sailing north or south.
Right.
The core argument, however, is that goals are terrible for sustained progress.
Let's break down the mechanics of why an outcome-based goal fails over the long term.
Consider the classic example of setting a goal to run a marathon. You train diligently for months. Your entire behavioral architecture, the 5 a.m. wake-ups, the specific diet, is tied to the anticipation of crossing that finish line.
Your motivation is tethered to that singular outcome.
Exactly. But what happens the Monday morning after the marathon is over?
You stop running. You sleep in. The shoes stay in the closet.
Right. You experience what psychologists call the yo-yo effect. The moment the outcome is achieved, the engine driving your motivation vanishes entirely.
Because the anticipation of the finish line is gone.
If your entire system of habits is built solely on achieving a specific result, you have engineered a temporary system. Outcomes, by their very nature, are fleeting. Once you achieve the goal, or conversely, if you fail to achieve the goal, the entire system collapses because its fuel source has been exhausted.
So if outcomes are merely a temporary fuel source that leads to a yo-yo effect, what is the sustainable engine? We have to move from what we want to achieve to who we are.
Yes. To keep the 4 laws running perpetually, you need a fundamental shift in that deepest layer of the onion. The only sustainable engine for long-term behavior change is a shift in identity.
Let's look deeply at how internal beliefs sustain this entire behavioral system, and more importantly, why the system rots without constant mechanical audits.
This is where identity voting comes in.
It is perhaps the most profound psychological shift in the entire text. It's a semantic shift, but it has massive structural implications. Let's explore the difference between two people who are trying to turn down a cigarette at a party.
This example perfectly illustrates the vulnerability of outcome-based habits. Person A is offered a cigarette and responds, "No thanks, I'm trying to quit."
On the surface, it sounds perfectly reasonable.
But structurally, it reveals a fatal flaw.
Why is it flawed?
Because it implies that their internal identity is still a smoker. They are a smoker who is just trying to act like a non-smoker for the evening. They are hoping their external behavior will change while their underlying core beliefs about who they are remain exactly the same.
They are relying on willpower to suppress their true identity.
Exactly.
And person B takes a different approach.
Person B is offered the cigarette and simply says, "No thanks, I'm not a smoker."
It is a tiny, almost imperceptible semantic difference, but it signals a massive shift in their cognitive architecture. Smoking is relegated to their former life, not their current one.
The core principle here is that behavior that is incongruent with the self will not last.
If you internally identify as a consumer, someone who loves buying the latest gadgets, you will find it nearly impossible to sustain a habit of saving money. Your identity will constantly pull you toward spending, because that is who you believe you are.
Right. If you identify as a foodie, sticking to a restrictive diet will always feel like deprivation.
This is why the framework argues that every single time you perform a habit, you are casting a vote for a specific identity.
Your identity is literally your repeated beingness. You aren't born with preset, immutable beliefs about yourself. Every belief, every aspect of your self-image is learned and conditioned through experience and repeated action.
So when you make your bed in the morning, you aren't just tidying a room. You are casting a vote for being an organized person. When you sit down and read a single page of a book, you are casting a vote for being a reader. The goal isn't to finish a book. The goal is to become a reader.
And as those votes accumulate, the evidence for your new identity grows. You begin to believe the new narrative because you have the behavioral data to back it up.
But let me play devil's advocate here. Doing the exact same microscopic thing every single day, reading that one page, making that bed inevitably gets boring.
It does.
And boredom is the silent killer of habits. If I cast a vote every day to be a reader by reading just one page, eventually my brain is going to stop producing that anticipatory dopamine spike because the novelty is completely gone. The challenge has evaporated.
That is a very real threat to the system. A robust behavioral architecture cannot survive on monotony. It requires the implementation of the Goldilocks rule.
The Goldilocks rule.
Yes. This rule dictates that humans experience peak motivation when they are working on tasks that are right on the edge of their current abilities.
Not too hard, not too easy, just right.
Exactly. If a task is too difficult, you experience failure, frustration, and anxiety, which breaks the habit. If it is too easy, you experience boredom, which also breaks the habit.
So what's the sweet spot?
Scientifically, to maintain motivation over years and to induce a state of flow, that psychological state of being completely immersed and energized by a task, the system must continually operate at roughly a 4% increase in difficulty beyond your current baseline capacity.
The sources give a fantastic historical example of this delicate balance using the comedian Steve Martin. When he was building his career, he didn't try to write a completely new hour-long comedy routine every single year.
That would be too difficult. The friction would be too high.
Instead, he expanded his routine by just a minute or two each year. He retained the jokes that he knew were mathematically guaranteed to get laughs. That provided his secure baseline and ensured the reward of audience approval.
But he added just enough new, untested material to keep himself intellectually engaged. He engineered just enough victories to feel successful and just enough new difficulty to stay highly motivated.
But maintaining that 4% edge requires a secondary subsystem. Habits alone are actually not enough for mastery. In fact, the framework introduces a concept called the trap of complacency.
It sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? How can a habit, which is the goal, become a trap?
Let's unpack the mechanics of that complacency.
It comes down to the very definition of a habit. A habit is a behavior that has been repeated so many times it has become automatic. It requires zero conscious cognitive load.
Right.
But once a behavior becomes automatic, the brain literally stops paying attention to it. You stop noticing tiny errors in your form, your performance plateaus. You assume you are doing it perfectly because it feels easy.
The equation in the text is stark. Habits plus deliberate practice equals mastery. Without deliberate practice, without a strict system of reflection and review, the system inevitably rots from the inside.
To prevent that rot, you need a mechanism to force awareness back into the automatic process.
And the ultimate historical masterclass in forced awareness and systematic auditing provided in the sources is the 1986 Los Angeles Lakers. Let's dive deep into this because it is a perfect example of auditing an existing, highly successful system.
The context of the Lakers at that time is crucial. In the 1985-1986 season, they possessed an immensely talented roster. They started the season 29-5 and were widely considered one of the most gifted teams in the history of the sport.
Yet, they choked in the playoffs. They didn't even make it to the finals.
Coach Pat Riley realized that physical talent wasn't the issue, and general motivation or desire to win wasn't the issue either. The issue was complacency.
The players' habits had become automatic and their performance had flatlined. They needed a microscopic audit system.
So Riley instituted what he called the CBE program, Career Best Effort. And the structural design of this program is mathematically brilliant. He didn't bring the team into the locker room and demand they be 50% better.
No, he asked for a marginal 1% improvement over their historical baseline.
But to get a true baseline, he didn't just look at the previous season. He tracked their individual statistics all the way back to their high school days to establish an absolute capability metric.
And crucially, he expanded the parameters of what they were actually measuring. It wasn't just about the obvious outcomes like points scored or rebounds. He assigned tangible mathematical value to what he called unsung hero deeds.
These were the microscopic processes of winning basketball that usually go unnoticed. Diving for a loose ball on the floor, willingly letting an opponent run into you to draw an offensive foul, sprinting to help a teammate who got beat on defense.
He quantified the invisible habits.
He did, and then comes the vital reflection component. He compared them constantly, month over month.
He would bring a player into his office, show them their data from November 1986, and stack it directly against their data from November 1985. The question was always, are you 1% better than you were exactly 1 year ago?
He also compared their scores to the league average for their specific position. The data shows that Magic Johnson would routinely score over 1,000 on this incredibly complex metric, while a solid average player scored somewhere in the 600s.
This is what a strict cycle of auditing looks like in practice. By constantly reviewing the data, Riley prevented the habits of his players from slipping into the trap of complacency. He forced them to stay precisely in that 4% Goldilocks zone.
And the result of this rigorous auditing, they won back-to-back NBA championships, becoming the first team to do so in 20 years.
Okay, I need to introduce a major dilemma here, a real pushback on the logic of the framework so far. If you were listening to this, you might have caught this contradiction.
Let's hear it.
On one hand, the framework says the ultimate goal of a habit is to make the response so incredibly easy that it becomes completely automatic and effortless. That's the third law. Make it easy, reduce all friction.
Correct.
But on the exact same hand, the Goldilocks rule says we need a constant 4% challenge to stay engaged, induce flow, and avoid the trap of complacency. If we inherently need a challenge to stay motivated, but habits are defined by being totally effortless, isn't there a fundamental, irreconcilable contradiction there? How do you keep a habit effortless and automatic, but also continually challenging?
That is the crux of the behavioral puzzle, and it's an excellent question. The resolution lies in separating the anatomy of the action into two distinct phases. We have to understand the difference between the initiation of the habit and the execution of the habit.
Break that down for me.
The initiation, the cue, and the craving, the act of simply getting started, must remain as frictionless, effortless, and automatic as humanly possible. You must ruthlessly eliminate all friction from the starting line.
Okay.
But the execution, the actual work being done once you have started, is where you apply the 4% scaling difficulty.
So if my goal is to build a running habit, putting on my running shoes, tying the laces, and stepping out the front door must be a zero friction event. It must be automatic.
Yes.
But the pace I run or the distance I cover once I'm already out the door is where I apply the 4% Goldilocks challenge.
Precisely. If the initiation phase is hard, if you have to search for your shoes in a dark closet every morning, you will never start. But if the execution phase is too easy, if you just casually walk around the block for 3 years, you will succumb to boredom and stop.
To manage this delicate balance, to ensure the initiation is always effortless, we cannot just rely on our internal cognitive state. We have to look externally. We have to design the physical spaces we inhabit to handle the initiation for us.
Which means we need to talk about environment redesign. If we want to make the initiation of a habit effortless, we have to respect what the text calls the law of least effort.
The human animal is fundamentally lazy by evolutionary design. We are wired to conserve energy at all costs.
That is the biological reality. Given two similar options, people will naturally unconsciously gravitate toward the option that requires the least amount of physical or cognitive work.
The text illustrates this using a fascinating example from evolutionary geography regarding farming practices. Historically, agricultural practices spread much faster along an east-to-west axis than they did along a north-to-south axis.
Because if you are a farmer expanding your territory to the east or west, you are staying in roughly the same climate zone. The sunlight is similar, the seasons are similar, the crops you already know how to grow will continue to grow.
But if you try to expand north or south, the climate changes drastically.
The environmental friction increases exponentially. Expanding north or south requires a massive amount of effort to learn new agricultural techniques, adapt to different frost cycles, and cultivate entirely new crops. Humanity naturally expanded along the path of least resistance.
So in behavioral design, the goal isn't to hype yourself up, drink 3 energy drinks, and pump up your motivation to overcome a high-friction environment. The goal is to remove the friction entirely.
The visual metaphor the framework uses is a garden hose that is bent in the middle, stopping the flow of water.
You can either crank up the water pressure at the valve, which is akin to using raw motivation and willpower to force the water through, or you can simply walk over and remove the bend in the hose.
Environment redesign is the act of removing the bend in the hose. It is about creating a high-agency environment where the cues for positive habits are incredibly obvious, and the friction to initiate them is essentially zero.
The framework talks extensively about priming your environment. This means resetting a room immediately after you use it, specifically preparing it for its next intended action.
It revolves around the concept of one space, one use. If you want to read more, you don't just tell yourself, I will read more often. That's too vague.
You dedicate a specific physical chair in your house solely to reading. You don't scroll on your phone in that chair.
Yeah.
You don't watch television in that chair. You rigorously stabilize the context of that physical location.
By doing so, you are training your neurological loop. When you sit in that specific chair, the environmental cue triggers the habit automatically. Your brain associates that physical geometry strictly with the habit of reading. You don't have to decide to read. The environment makes the decision for you.
We see this same principle applied with habit stacking. You tie a new desired habit to an existing rock-solid anchor habit that you already perform every day. After I pour my morning cup of coffee, I will meditate for exactly 1 minute.
The physical act of pouring the coffee becomes an unavoidable environmental cue that triggers the new behavior.
And we can escalate this concept even further into what behavioral economists call commitment mechanisms, or the Ulysses contract.
I love this concept. A Ulysses contract is making a choice in the present moment that strictly locks in your future behavior, removing your ability to back out when your willpower inevitably fades.
The historical example of this in the text is absolutely brilliant. It involves the legendary author Victor Hugo. He was facing a massive, seemingly impossible deadline from his publisher for his novel, The Hunchback of Notre Dame.
He had spent the entire previous year intensely procrastinating. He was hosting lavish dinner parties, entertaining guests, and acting like a Parisian socialite instead of a dedicated writer.
His publisher had finally had enough and threatened him with a strict, non-negotiable 6-month deadline to deliver the entire manuscript.
Now, Hugo didn't just sit down and try to summon more willpower. He didn't just write, work harder on a piece of parchment. He fundamentally engineered his physical environment to make failure impossible.
He gathered up all of his formal clothing, every suit, every jacket, handed them to his assistant, and ordered the assistant to lock them away in a large, heavy chest.
He was left with absolutely nothing to wear except a large knitted shawl.
By doing this, he literally removed his physical ability to leave the house. He lacked the appropriate clothing to go outside and socialize in 19th century Paris. He forced his own hand through extreme environmental design.
He removed the option to procrastinate. Confined to his study with nothing else to do, he wrote furiously and actually finished the massive manuscript weeks ahead of the deadline.
It is a phenomenal story, but here is where we, as analysts, must critically examine the limitations of these external mechanisms. A Ulysses contract, like Hugo locking away his clothes, is highly effective at forcing a response in the short term.
It physically removes the friction of decision-making by eliminating the bad habit as an option. But, and this is a massive structural caveat, it does not resolve internal identity dissonance.
Explain that dissonance for the listener. Why is the locked trunk not enough?
Because if Victor Hugo still internally identified as a socialite rather than a dedicated writer, the Ulysses contract is nothing more than a temporary dam holding back a river.
The very moment the publisher's deadline passes, the moment the lock is removed from the chest and he gets his clothes back, the external friction is gone.
And because his internal identity hasn't changed, that identity will violently reassert itself. He would immediately revert to hosting parties and procrastinating.
So an external mechanism cannot cure an internal identity crisis. It can only suppress it temporarily. If the environment changes, the habit breaks.
Precisely. If you use a website blocker to stop looking at social media while you work, but you still fundamentally identify as someone who needs constant digital validation, the moment you turn off the blocker, you will binge the behavior. The external tool must eventually be paired with an internal identity shift.
Which brings me to my biggest critique of this entire framework. As we look at the whole system, the layers, the loops, the environment, it feels like we are trapped in a massive logical circularity. It is a behavioral chicken and egg scenario.
How do you mean?
Let's look at the 2 core premises we've discussed today. Premise 1. The text states clearly that your habits shape your identity. Every time you write a page, you cast a vote for being a writer. The behavior creates the belief.
Right.
But premise 2 states, your identity dictates your habits. Behavior that is incongruent with your core identity will not last. So structurally, which comes first?
Ah, I see.
If a listener currently identifies as a chronic procrastinator, the framework says they must take action, they must execute a habit to build new evidence for a new identity. But their current identity as a procrastinator will actively, biologically, prevent them from taking that initial action.
They are stuck in a closed loop.
They can't act because of their identity, and they can't change their identity because they don't act.
It is a profound philosophical and mechanical knot. If the system is a perfectly closed loop where habits reinforce identity and identity drives habits, then a system at rest will stay at rest indefinitely. A negative identity will perpetually generate negative habits, which in turn provide evidence that reinforces the negative identity.
So how do we break it?
The only way to break a perfectly circular system is to introduce a paradox.
Which brings us to our final thought for this deep dive. The final paradox. The concept of the starting vote.
If we accept the foundational premise that an identity emerges solely from accumulated behavioral evidence, a tally of votes cast over time, how is the very first vote cast? How do you initiate systemic change when the starting dominant identity is the exact programming you are desperately trying to replace?
If the system is purely based on historical evidence, the chronic procrastinator has 10,000 votes for procrastination and absolute 0 votes for taking action. The math dictates they will procrastinate again today.
To solve this, you have to realize that the genesis of change requires a temporary suspension of internal reality. To cast that very first vote, you must essentially act as an imposter to yourself. You have to actively, consciously commit identity fraud against your current self.
Identity fraud. That is an incredibly powerful way to phrase it.
You must consciously decide to cast a rogue vote. A vote that is deeply uncomfortable. A vote that actively contradicts your existing programming, your feelings, and your historical evidence. You have to sit in the chair and write a single sentence, knowing full well your brain is screaming at you, "We are not a writer, we are a procrastinator, this isn't who we are."
You have to tolerate the intense cognitive dissonance of being an imposter in your own life for just a few minutes.
You have to fake it mechanically until the votes accumulate. You cast one rogue vote, it feels unnatural. Then you cast another, and another. And eventually those rogue votes reach a critical mass.
They hit a tipping point, and they begin to actually rewrite the system's core code. The imposter becomes the authentic self.
The system doesn't change because you went on a retreat and suddenly found yourself or summoned endless motivation. The system changes because you methodically, mechanically hijack the voting process until the new identity won the election.
So as we wrap up this technical analysis, we want to leave you, the listener, with a challenge for your own cognitive architecture. Think back to the diagnostic muddy waters we discussed at the very beginning. We can't give you a clean x-ray of your habits.
No, we can't.
We can't point to a white line on a film and say, there's the exact reason you can't stick to your routine. The architecture of your behavior is incredibly complex. It is tied to dopamine, to environmental cues, to prehistoric hardware, and to the deep stories you tell yourself about who you are. But it is an architecture.
It is a mechanical system.
And systems, no matter how complex, can be hacked.
They can be audited, disassembled, redesigned, and optimized, one microscopic 1% increment at a time.
Ask yourself today, right now, what is the rogue vote you need to cast? What small atomic action can you take today that feels like identity fraud right now, but is the necessary first step toward rewriting your core code? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
If this video was useful, give it a like, subscribe, and share. More systems and frameworks in the next Eudaimanya video.